Welcome to the Containment Zone, where the forest ends and the water holds its breath. SCP-2316 is a lake, a real lake, tucked behind overgrown trees and forgotten roads just south of Lansing, Michigan. It doesn't shimmer, it doesn't glow, it reflects nothing but clouds and the faint smell of salt, where there shouldn't be any. But if you look long enough, you'll see them. Human shapes, barely breaching the surface, shoulders, faces, dozens, maybe hundreds. They do not float, they do not move, they simply stand, neck deep, watching. You may think, they drowned. You may feel, they look familiar. And then, without understanding why, you'll find a name forming in your mouth. Someone you knew, someone you lost, a person whose memory you can't place, but swear you should. That's when the voice inside you begins. It doesn't scream. It doesn't threaten. It says one thing, over and over. You do not recognize the bodies in the water, but you do. And you will swear that you always have. And that's the anomaly. Not what's in the lake, but what it does to your memory. What it reshapes, what it rewrites, until you follow them in and never come back. The first official record of SCP-2316 came from a wildlife survey team working for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. They were conducting routine water sampling on what local maps marked as Lake Wendigo, a shallow basin fed by underground runoff and seasonal melt. It had no dock, no known fish population, and no recreational use. They expected algae. What they found were faces, dozens of them, still, motionless, partially submerged, and all looking in the same direction. The team called it in. Police arrived. By the time authorities made contact, only one researcher remained coherent, pale, soaked to the waist, clutching a field notebook with torn pages and water-warped ink. His name was Dr. Colin Everett. He never spoke again. What he left behind was a single written phrase repeated across 13 pages. I recognize the bodies in the water. The others? One walked directly into the lake and disappeared. Another was found 2 miles away, barefoot, repeating a child's name no one on record could identify. All 5 were taken into Foundation custody by the end of the week. What followed was a complete black site lockdown. A 3-kilometer perimeter was established. Lake Wendigo was removed from all public records. Surrounding terrain was reforested with fast-growing conifer species to obscure satellite visibility. The Foundation renamed the site 2316 Lambda. Standard monastics were issued to all perimeter agents. No one was allowed visual contact with the lake without neural dampeners, because observation alone was enough to trigger the effect. D-class trials confirmed it. The first test subject saw the water, paused, and wept. He gave the name of a childhood friend, someone who had drowned at age 10. But when personnel checked his background, no such friend existed. The subject had never known anyone by that name. He just remembered what the lake wanted him to. That was the pattern. SCP-2316 does not project hallucinations. It builds false memories, custom-tailored, emotionally precise, familiar enough to bypass suspicion. And once those memories are accepted, the subject moves forward, into the water, to join them. Containment Protocol 2316-Omega was issued. No physical approach within 500 meters, observation permitted by drone only. All personnel must repeat the phrase, I do not recognize the bodies in the water, before and after exposure. Not for security, but for survival. SCP-2316 doesn't spread like a disease. It spreads like a memory, one that feels like it was always there. Even if you've never seen this lake, even if you've never lost anyone at all, in clinical terms, it's a non-viral mimetic agent embedded in visual contact with the lake's surface. In simpler language, you remember what never happened. The memories are tailored, but not random. Each test subject reports bodies in the lake bearing the faces of people they once knew. Siblings, classmates, teammates, lost friends. Individuals who, by record, either never existed or died under unrelated circumstances. One D-class subject, D-2094, approached the edge for less than 10 seconds. Upon return, he began humming an elementary school chant, "Down by the river where the cold wind blows." He couldn't recall where he learned it, but he insisted the children in the lake were the ones who taught it to him. When interviewed under amnestic suppression, his responses changed. He became confused, disoriented, angry. He shouted, "They died in that crash, didn't they? I was supposed to go with them." But his school records showed no such crash, no such names, no corresponding victims. He'd never attended school near a lake, and yet he drew a map, matching Lake Wendigo's topography. In perfect detail, D-2094 expired 72 hours later. No trauma, no illness, just neural collapse. His brain waves faded like a battery losing charge, as though something else had called him back. The same pattern repeated with drone operators. One remote technician, stationed off-site and viewing only thermal satellite relays, began describing dreams, not of the lake, but of standing in waist-deep water, holding hands with someone who kept sinking. She said their face was unresolved, but familiar. Another analyst left behind a note, "I know now why they're there. They remember for me, so I don't have to." The conclusion became unavoidable. SCP-2316 infects you with memory. It offers grief, a feeling of incompleteness, of belonging somewhere you've never been. And once you believe that, once your mind agrees with what your eyes see, you're not safe anywhere. Because it's not about the lake anymore. It's about who you believe is in it. It began with a drone, a simple thermal overpass. Routine surveillance run over Lake Wendigo's western edge. No contact, no descent. But during re-entry, the drone's imaging software flagged an anomaly. A cluster of heat signatures near the surface. Standard, expected. But one of them moved, not underwater, not around. It looked up. For 0.6 seconds, the camera feed locked on a face. Unblinking, human, water cascading over the eyes. The thermal reading spiked, and then the drone disconnected. It didn't crash. It simply ceased transmission, as if whatever was in the lake had looked back and decided to follow the signal. 6 hours later, Site 98 went into partial lockdown. Personnel began reporting memory disturbances. 3 agents left their posts to walk barefoot toward the lake perimeter, each one whispering a name, each name different, none verifiable. A 4th agent, Lieutenant Sarah Keene, refused to wear amnestic dampeners. When questioned, she said, "It's my brother. He didn't drown. He was taken." Her file listed no siblings, no extended family. But when her quarters were searched, a photograph was found. 2 children standing beside a lake, one matching Keene, the other blurred. The Foundation launched Extraction Protocol Theta-3. Goal: remove and neutralize an affected subject before cognitive breach advanced. Lieutenant Keene was sedated, placed in an isolation chamber, all external stimuli removed. For 17 minutes, she remained unconscious. Then her vitals flatlined. Security footage showed no movement, no trauma. But just before death, she smiled. The audio recorder picked up a whisper, almost imperceptible. "I remember now. I went with them." But there was no one else in the room. The incident forced an overhaul of containment procedures. Drone-based observation was limited to infrared. Visual analysis required double-layer cognitive filtering. Any personnel reporting emotional disturbance were rotated out within 24 hours, and from that point on, all field logs began with the same phrase, "I do not recognize the bodies in the water." Not because it's true, but because it's the only thing standing between you and the memory waiting to be written into your mind. The Foundation initially believed SCP-2316 to be inert, static, a lake haunted by memory and perception. That assumption was incorrect. Over time, patterns emerged, not in the water, but in the way people saw it. Every exposure led to the same questions, the same rituals, the same spiral. Subjects asked, how long have they been there? Why didn't anyone help them? Do you remember the accident? There was no accident, not in any file, not in any newspaper, but the story repeated itself across languages, across backgrounds, always involving a crash, a list of names, a feeling of absence, a script. Something was implanting not just memories, but a narrative, a repeating emotional cycle, recognition, guilt, belonging. That made 2316 more than mimetic. It made it literate, a machine that doesn't just replicate trauma, but writes it, one mind at a time. Cross-referencing logs from unrelated anomalies revealed disturbing overlaps. Subjects exposed to SCP-2316 began dreaming about places they had never visited. Lakes, rivers, tunnels, always water, always faces. In one case, a subject previously assigned to SCP-3895, an entirely different aquatic anomaly, suffered a panic attack when reviewing 2316 documentation. He claimed the names in the file were his, that he could hear them calling from the shoreline. But he had never been near the lake. This suggested something deeper. SCP-2316's effect may extend beyond proximity. A remote mimetic signature, an echo strong enough to infect adjacent thought. The Foundation launched a containment review. All personnel assigned to aquatic SCPs were tested for shared memory fragments. Several failed. One agent, who had never worked near Site-2316, reported waking up in her quarters, soaked, cold, with footprints trailing from the edge of her bed to the door, and when she turned on the light, there was lake water on the floor. No leak, no source, just a trail that led nowhere. It evaporated in minutes. When asked what happened, she said, "Someone visited, but I wasn't ready to remember yet." The Foundation initially believed SCP-2316 to be inert, static, a lake haunted by memory and perception. That assumption was incorrect. Over time, patterns emerged, not in the water, but in the way people saw it. Every exposure led to the same questions, the same rituals, the same spiral. Subjects asked, how long have they been there? Why didn't anyone help them? Do you remember the accident? There was no accident, not in any file, not in any newspaper, but the story repeated itself, across languages, across backgrounds, always involving a crash, a list of names, a feeling of absence, a script. Something was implanting not just memories, but a narrative, a repeating emotional cycle, recognition, guilt, belonging. That made 2316 more than mimetic. It made it literate. A machine that doesn't just replicate trauma, but writes it, one mind at a time. Cross-referencing logs from unrelated anomalies revealed disturbing overlaps. Subjects exposed to SCP-2316 began dreaming about places they had never visited. Lakes, rivers, tunnels, always water, always faces. In one case, a subject previously assigned to SCP-3895, an entirely different aquatic anomaly, suffered a panic attack when reviewing 2316 documentation. He claimed the names in the file were his, that he could hear them calling from the shoreline. But he had never been near the lake. This suggested something deeper. SCP-2316's effect may extend beyond proximity, a remote mimetic signature, an echo strong enough to infect adjacent thought. The Foundation launched a containment review. All personnel assigned to aquatic SCPs were tested for shared memory fragments. Several failed. One agent, who had never worked near Site-2316, reported waking up in her quarters, soaked, cold, with footprints trailing from the edge of her bed to the door, and when she turned on the light, there was lake water on the floor. No leak, no source, just a trail that led nowhere. It evaporated in minutes. When asked what happened, she said, "Someone visited, but I wasn't ready to remember yet." The Foundation no longer classifies SCP-2316 as a passive anomaly, not simply because of what it does, but because of how precisely it does it. Several working theories have emerged. The first is the cognitive residue hypothesis, that the lake is not anomalous by nature, but by consequence. That at some unknown point, possibly decades ago, an event occurred within the lake basin, a mass trauma, a sacrifice, an experiment gone wrong. The emotional residue of that moment saturated the water and lingers in the reflection. What's seen on the surface isn't reality. It's a mirrored mnemonic echo that transmits directly into the subconscious. The second theory is more abstract. The anchor memory model. It suggests SCP-2316 functions as a psychological magnet, seeking resonance with human memory. Each observer doesn't hallucinate randomly. Instead, they are targeted, matched to fabricated memories specifically tailored to feel organic. It doesn't create fantasy. It fabricates familiarity, down to the tone of a voice, the way a name feels in your mouth, the weight of a promise you're certain you made, to someone who never existed. The third theory is the most disturbing. SCP-2316 is not a location. It's a reminder, a global failsafe, a conceptual entity embedded within human cognition to trigger guilt, mourning, and emotional paralysis whenever specific mental thresholds are crossed. An ancient mechanism designed not to inform, but to disable. One researcher wrote, "What if SCP-2316 is a lock? Not to keep us out, but to keep something else in." Another took it further. What if it's not showing us people who died? What if it's showing us the versions of ourselves that should have? Versions that made a choice, said yes when they should have said no, walked forward instead of running. Versions that stepped into the lake and were replaced by the you who walked away. That might explain why the bodies never rise, why they never speak. Because they don't need to. You're the one who buried them. You just forgot. Until now, SCP-2316 is contained, not with fences, not with weapons, but with denial. Perimeter agents don't guard a hazard. They protect the people nearby, from the moment they start to remember. Because once you recognize the bodies in the water, it's too late. They don't need to move. They don't need to speak. They only need you to remember what they were. And once you do, you'll feel the pull. Not a command, not a voice, just belonging, like you were part of it, like you left something behind, and deep down, some part of you knows you did. It's not a haunting, it's a homecoming, but it's not your home, and they're not your friends. Because the final truth of SCP-2316 is not that the bodies are real, not that they died, but that you were never supposed to remember them. That's the containment. That's the rule. You do not recognize the bodies in the water. Say it again, out loud, because the longer you wait, the more they start to look like someone you miss, someone you failed, someone who never existed. Until now. Thank you for reviewing another anomaly in the Containment Zone. And if you ever find yourself standing beside still water and you think you see someone out there, don't look closer, don't call out, and above all, do not remember them.